Gosh, isn't that true? What a beautiful story. You have to be able to look at the thing that scares you. You have to be able to look at darkness. You have to be able to look at glory as well. And you can't look away from either of those, right? And that's the thing is only as you can, the darkest thing that you can look at probably parallels to the brightest thing that you can look at,
Yeah.
right? And this is the problem of evil, which I think will come back. I think we're coming back to is that
Yeah.
if you have the courage to look into the heart of darkness of humanity, just how dark things can get, and then you'll see reflected in it the light of the true good. And this is why I feel bad for a lot of people that refuse to look at, we might call them alternate explorations for historical world events, like some of the things we're going through. And
Yeah.
they dismiss people as conspiracy theorists or whatever. It's like, no, look at this, because it's only by looking at this, and for sure by looking at this, that you'll pop out and realize if that amount of darkness exists, there must be light.
No worries. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Mhm.
It's quite a pleasure to get to. I discovered your um, Renaissance of Men podcast recently. Um, I'm not sure how I ended up there, but once I got there, I started listening through to your dialogues and really found it really neat, really intriguing, and just your perspective and everything. Your guests are pretty awesome. Usually, they have a lot to say, and so I want to say thank you first of all for taking the time. It's a pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm glad that you found the podcast. I'm glad that you're enjoying it. It's
Yeah.
my podcast is my pride and joy in many ways, and I love talking about these ideas. And as soon as I saw your podcast title, the philosophical gospel, I'm like, that sounds pretty cool.
Thanks. Yeah, and that's exactly what the intent of it was coming to the gospel through philosophy was a weird way by
Oh,
which to
interesting.
arrive at it. But since that is the method that ended up ultimately convincing me of the objective truth of Christianity was through the philosophical realm,
That's
in
so
a
cool.
wild, winding way. So that's how the title of mine got named, and hopefully it continues forth with dispensing with stuff like this. And I guess the same goes. My question for you is, the Renaissance of Men is a neat title. Um, Implies, that men might need to refine position, purpose, intent in our society, or there's a loss of it, or a crisis maybe of masculinity. And I wanted to ask if you don't mind expounding upon the title and what sparked your interest in starting something like that.
Well, first, it's actually a reflection of my own journey. So I first started. Um, I guess researching isn't really the right word, but being interested in issues of men and masculinity when I was in college. I took a class on Carl Jung and psychology, and I remember he talked about the professor talked about in the class about how to understand masculinity in the Lord of the Rings, and the movies were just coming out at the time, and so it was like everyone was super into them, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because I had grown up like a very thoughtful kind of kid, into reading science fiction and working real hard to get into a good school and everything. And everything that I had been told about men and masculinity, or so that it seemed, was like football, pizza, beer, and stuff like that. And that just wasn't me. That was never me. There wasn't any interest. Um, and so when I took this class and understood uh, that men are more complicated than I had been told, it was a really big awakening for me. And so I think I just continued after that point, studying, trying to understand myself as a man, and just being really interested in the topic until 2013. I went on the Mankind Project New Warrior Training Adventure, which was very powerful and was like a men's initiation. And once I saw the power of men's initiation, and that so many different men, including men who I thought were the big tough guys that had it all figured out, that they didn't have anything figured out either. That all these different kinds of men really had a lot to learn from each other. I realized this picture of men is more complicated than even I thought. And then the final step really was in 2017, 2018, is when I discovered a space called the Manosphere, through the writings of Rollo Tomasi and Jack Donovan. and a bunch of others. And then that was a discovery of like sometimes these big, tough, strong guys have their own questions in addition to the scholarly guys. And so that's when I discovered there's this whole big rebirth of masculinity going on. I read all the books, started watching the videos and reading the Twitter accounts. And so what I realized is it's not any one thing. It's a bunch of different things that are happening all at once. And it's a lot like the Italian Renaissance, where there wasn't any like one leader telling everyone how to be. It was just this collective reappraisal of like, well, what does it mean to be human? And where all these different artists and scholars and philosophers, architects and sculptors and painters who weren't in competition with each other, but were all creating this whole new thing. And so that's what I see happening with men now, is that all these men aren't necessarily in competition with each other, but we're all different reflections of what it means to be a man. And together we're giving this rebirth to what it means to be a man. And so that's where the notion of the Renaissance of men came from, because it is a renaissance or a rebirth of men.
Interesting. Yeah. And I've heard, a few of the people that I follow and listen to, a couple of professors kind of making statements that we find ourselves right now in a meaning crisis, not just gender or masculine specific, but a lack of objective logos by which to orient towards. There's a lack of a footing for, and like you said, the roles of men and women now seem very dynamic. I'm of the question whether or not they're going to still even exist in verbiage that you're going to have. And you hear this a lot, and I just I think it's something similar to a meaning crisis that kind of precipitates what we see now, with like the push for egalitarianism kind of overrides the fact that there are intrinsic differences between men and women.
Yes.
And that intrinsic differences have been it seems to me like we're trying to, as a society, potentially make it to where those intrinsic differences are no longer paid homage, that it's just egalitarian, equal. And so that's an interesting thing to me, and to see just the language and the way in which we don't even recognize much of the intrinsic and objective differences between men and women, that maybe that's not the most promising thing. But I don't know how much that plays into the masculine ideal of what you're speaking of. But go ahead.
No, I mean, I think they're very connected. And you said the magic word, which is language. And someone told me, I think I saw a YouTube video a while ago where the title of the war, or the title of the video, or the point that was communicated in the video was, we're in the middle of a spiritual war being conducted through language. That the definitions of terms, the language is being shifted around us. And a really good example of that you mentioned is equality. So one of the things, so when you and I say equality, or when equality is said in the dialogue, we're thinking of equality of legal status, economic equality, right? Well, this Marxist cultural war that we're suffering under, which is actually an anti-human, anti-God war, that we're suffering under, actually has its own definition of equality. And that definition is much closer to sameness. So when you and I hear equality, we're like, oh yeah, men and women are equal already. No, what they mean is sameness. So that's what happens, is that the notion of equality and sameness are getting conflated. And that's what we're missing in the public dialogue.
That's a good way for me to make it palatable to understand, saying, the sameness. Yeah. And it's actually a war on God and humanity. That's an interesting way of looking at it, because it sometimes feels as if that's the case, that it's not this virtuous outreach into society to try to make everything more fair, but rather it's like a mockery of virtue, and a way to cheaply get a virtuous karma or something, because you stand with this group that's persecuted, so therefore by default your association makes you a better person than others who might think otherwise. And so it is kind of that's an interesting point you make about how it's really a war on humans and God more so than anything else. And equality is a big reason why I think Christianity as a religion has become so powerful and so dominant, really, or is because it did call for equality. It did call for a more egalitarian approach than the Roman Empire, so let's say, had.
Mm.
The
Hmm.
teachings of Christ, from what I've come to understand in a historical sense and an ethical sense, is Christian ethics that permeated the fabric of most human civilizations post the Roman Empire, really.
Yeah.
And I think that equality that we're speaking of between ourselves is certainly Christian in a lot of ways. And sometimes the Christian religion is contorted in a way that makes it seem as if, there's different way, that some people use it for different reasons or contort the language. But I think that Christianity most certainly cries for equality. And I guess going to that point on Christianity, one of the reasons I synergized with a lot of your discussions with people was I have recently converted to Christianity as well. And
Praise God. Hallelujah.
yes, sir. And I found your podcast and heard you mentioning your recent conversion.
Mm.
Um, I kind of wanted to look at a compare and contrast kind of thing between yourself and maybe my experience. And
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you kind of in regard to your podcast, but what overall brought you to Christianity, as to the correct objective truth to you was, and that's somewhat recent. So I wanted to ask you how that looked for you.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, welcome, brother. I'm grateful to be sharing some fellowship with you.
Likewise.
Yeah, I would say, I mentioned that I started studying masculinity when I was in college. I started studying religion and spirituality when I was 12 years old because I was born Jewish. I was bar mitzvahed, and as part of my bar mitzvah, my Torah portion, which is like the portion of the Bible that the pastor gives in the sermon, my Torah portion was the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments, I remember sitting in the rabbi's office as he was talking to me about my Torah portion, which I didn't choose it, by the way. I was assigned it. It was just, I don't know if it was random or what, but I didn't pick it. And the rabbi was saying, the second five of the Ten Commandments are there so you don't break the first five. I was like, oh, that's really, yeah, right. That's really interesting. Like I wouldn't have
Yeah.
thought that the Ten Commandments would have structure to them, but that was the first time I remember like a little light going on, like, oh, that's interesting. I was 12. And then I've just had a really ongoing interest in religion and spirituality ever since then. It's been about 30 years now. And I guess my path, I remember you sent me an email before and you were talking about your path and you said this now that was through philosophy. And then I got it because my path was actually through world religions that I've explored, Christianity. I was born Jewish. I went to a Catholic high school. I lived in the Bay Area. So of course I was exposed to a whole bunch of New Age stuff. And then I've traveled a bunch. And so I've explored Hinduism and Buddhism and all these different world faiths. And I traveled through all of them and I noticed that they all had holes in them. And I was trying to figure out what the whole was, particularly related. A lot of them have a real problem with real challenge dealing with the problem of evil. And so I'll compress a very long story into just a couple quick notes. I went to Burning Man. If you've ever heard of the Burning Man
Yeah.
festival, yeah. So I went to Burning Man in 2015. I had been before, and while I was there, I met a Christian ministry group that had been going for 12 years. They didn't
Wow.
really advertise that they were Christian, but they were there doing healing work, and they first introduced me to Christ. And then I traveled and did a bunch of the stuff and realized, that I had mentioned with in terms of finding all the holes in the different religions and practices. And then when I returned to the United States in early 2020, like in February, the same friends who introduced me to Christ at Burning Man gave me a book called Simply Christian by N.T. Wright.
Oh,
And
wow.
I read this book and I got it. I got it. And then I read the Screw Tape Letters and Mere Christianity. And I was like, this is the first time anyone's talked to me about Christianity like I'm an adult. And it made
Yeah.
total sense. And so I came in through the door of religion. It sounds like you came in through the door of philosophy, which is really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. That's super neat to, I know what you mean by like things start to click. And when I say philosophy, I mean, it's been a compressed, compact journey through philosophy to Christianity over the
Sure.
course of probably a year and a half. And it started with me, not with the problem so much of evil, but with the problem of, yeah, with the evil and suffering. Um, I was like real atheistic, real materialistic. I didn't see anything that wasn't physical as being real. And
Mm.
I was very boisterous and loud with my atheistic beliefs in the past.
You're one of those.
Yeah, like when
Yeah.
I was and it's been about 7, 8 years since I've been that way, but for a while I was like that. I was throwing it in
Yeah.
people's faces, and my whole um personality kind of centered around why I could tell you you were wrong. And I don't know what the
Hmm.
reason was, but that was what I was conducting as my worldview. And then I had just some hard times, I guess you'd say, or tribulations and trials, and realized that, oh, there's, if you're an atheist or if you believe everything is just an accidental arrangement of matter, then whenever something like that happens, you can't really integrate it back into your worldview, because all it seems to you is useless suffering. And so
Right.
I was looking for a way by which to continue forward in the world, um, and to be able to integrate my experiences in a way that I could understand the suffering. And
Mm.
doing that, I went through Hinduism and I went through Buddhism. I started going to Hindu temples, like you just mentioned, and
Hmm.
I started reading Hindu texts, like the Vedic texts, the Bhagavad Gita, stuff like that. And I was doing that, meditating with them, and doing all of that. And I realized they all centered around the notion of suffering just as much. But
Yeah.
Christianity was the only one that gave you a conduit by which to take your suffering and transmute it into something of value. It gave you a way by which
Yep.
to exist in the world rather than retreat into a monastery.
Yep.
And
Yep. Yep.
so, what was your kind of experience like with the Eastern religious practices? Did you find any resonance with those? Did it point you to Christianity kind of, or are you still looking because there was those gaps?
I wouldn't say that they did point me to Christianity. A lot of my experiences, I actually did travel through India for 6 months, and I went to the Kumbh Mela Hindu festival, bathed in the Ganges River 5 times, where the river's still
Oh,
clean.
cool.
And so, yeah, India was an amazing, amazing transformative experience. Very difficult. Um, I don't know that I would say that they pointed me towards Christianity per se, but they left all these questions unanswered. Like I had learned about, like Jeffrey Epstein type stuff. I had learned about that in 2013, and so I had real trouble once I did, dealing with a lot of the New Age stuff where it's like, well, good and evil are just an illusion that's created by our subjective minds, and it's all just one. And that really troubled me because I don't know that you could look at a child going through something like that and say, sorry, kid, it's just your karma. Like that seems
Yeah.
like a profoundly terrible thing to say. Or like I'm sorry, you terrible torturer person, it's just your karma too. Like that doesn't make sense. And it's ultimately, like you said, it's self-negate, it negates life. It's like your ultimate goal is to, extinguish your own existence. Non-existence is the goal. And
Yeah.
I don't know that the mind I don't know that the mind can undo the knot of itself. It's like a riddle, like, and you just keep chasing it all the way down to the bottom. It's like your consciousness needs to end your own consciousness. Like, can you do that?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Versus Christianity, which says that your free will, your consciousness is unique and precious and sacred, and it can continue for all of eternity in communion with God and bliss and fulfillment. It's just going to cost you something here on earth. That
Yeah.
seems like a pretty reasonable trade to me.
I agree. Yeah, yeah, without a doubt. Yeah, your consciousness, yeah, ending your own consciousness, which just seems, yeah, and like you said, the idea of the Christian notion of free will and the ability to choose is a critical element of being human. And a lot of the Eastern practices, especially as I started meditating and practicing a lot of the
Mhm.
Buddhist tradition, was what you just said. It was this idea to dissolve, first of all, the notion of the self, which is
Mhm.
an enigmatic like construction to begin with, how you define it, how people come about defining self. But then it
Yeah.
then once they tell you, once you grasp that teaching of the Advaita Vedanta or the non-dual stuff,
Ugh.
then it has you going towards the dissolution of individual free choice. And so then the philosophers that I was following and the teachers of meditation also had a high priority on plate to make sure that the followers and adherents of these practices also acknowledge the complete and utter lack of any free will, that you are simply a deterministic,
Yep.
you're just dominoes that fell over, or you're just one of those dominoes that's deterministically going to fall as it will.
Yep.
And Christianity at least tells you something different than that, wouldn't you say?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what Hinduism, Eastern mysticism, which authors were you reading? If you were reading Vedanta, which authors were you reading? Do you remember?
Yeah. Well, I was reading like the actual Vedic text. I read the
Oh,
Upanishads,
Oh
I was
wow.
reading the Upanishad. Oh yeah, this was
You went
wild,
straight
man.
for the stuff, man. You went straight
Oh
for it.
yeah, oh it's straight to the stuff, and
Cheers to you, man. A lot of
and
people, they read digests of that stuff or they read westernizations. That you read the actual thing. Good for you
yes,
in its own way, right?
yes, yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, I agree that yeah, that's not the traditional route. And really, what placed me at wanting to read the Bhagavad Gita, specifically the Vedic text, is my inquiry had come after I was looking into this. I had some periods of suffering and all that. I still wasn't trying to remove my own agency from the situation I put myself
Right.
in. I didn't want, I knew that probably 50-50 I had done enough to get me there and the people had done enough to me. Like there was something there. I
Hmm.
could have had I could have been headed more in the right direction. I could have been doing what was right, which would have prevented a lot of this. And so I didn't want to dissolve myself just for the sake of being able to say it's not my fault. I mean, that's not what I
Yeah.
wanted. Oh, I wanted to say, yes, it's my fault, but how do I continue? Um, and I
Hmm.
started, I made
Mm.
I made the prime inquiry into mind and matter. And I had never thought about it before, but all of a sudden it came to me that there's no way in heck that somehow matter rearranged itself into consciousness at any point. That
Hmm.
consciousness doesn't, I was like, this is the most insane question to ask. And I found out, oh, people have been asking this mind matter question for a while. Then I was like, what's mind? Well, eventually found out that Bhagavad Gita and the Vedic texts actually address consciousness a lot. And so I was like, oh, maybe they have the right answers.
Hmm.
And so their books read like scientific manuals almost
Yeah.
to consciousness more so than a personal narrative.
Yes, that's the appeal of our scientism kind of age, right? It's a very try before you buy. Who knows if it's true? See if it works for you. Don't take
Yep.
our dogmatic approach to it. And so for a lot of people that want to reject Christianity or reject because Christianity can seem very dogmatic at times because it's like, no, this is reality. But what I say is like gravity is pretty dogmatic as well. Like,
Oh yeah,
right?
it is.
So it's very much like, no, like this is the way it is, and you have to have faith in that, versus these Eastern texts are like, no, you can try it, and because you validate that it works for you, it must be good. That's the jump, right? That
Oh
just
yeah.
because it works doesn't mean it's necessarily good.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah, I see what you're saying, and that makes perfect sense. And you were mentioning a second ago kind of the problem of evil.
Yeah.
And it is a major problem because if I were to steel man the best argument against my Christian faith, it would be centered around the notion of evil and
Right.
how Christians are unable to, or there's an inability for them to formulate any proper way to address it. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that.
I don't
That's
think
how
that's I don't agree with that, but yeah.
no, I don't really either, but that's what all the Christian tradition I was raised in and all that. There
Oh.
wasn't, yeah. So I agree 100% that there's plethora of answers to these by
Yeah, okay.
intelligent men, but for some reason, as in my upbringing, I was never exposed to any church fathers. I was just a very
Oh,
fundamentalist Protestantism.
okay.
And so as I moved around as a child with different family members and all that, it was always that same kind of brand of Christianity. And so once I became atheist, like in my teenage years, I was like, all I knew was that Christianity. And I didn't know about any of these saints, fathers of the church, any of those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned evil. And then I found Augustine's Confessions, his book, and Augustine
Mm.
particularly wrestles with that notion significantly. And he comes to the conclusion too, like you're saying, that there's not these two combating, dueling forces of evil versus good. And there's, one side of the team is playing against the other. Um, he came to the conclusion that evil needed a little more of a sophisticated answer. And so I guess I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the notion of suffering and evil in the Christian context? And do you see things dualistically, like there's two battling forces duking it out? Or how do you see the worldview of Christianity in relation to that?
I think I think any I want to be careful how I say this language. So just go with me for a second because the second
Yeah.
sentence will make more sense. I think any notion of good and evil being separate things is illusory because this is not a Vedanta, monist kind of, because ultimately all things work together for the good, right? So the notion, so Satan, evil, has free will and is able to act, and yet still, despite itself, feeds into the ultimate production of the good, which is the total frustration and stifling of evil eternally, which is like evil, no matter what it does, feeds into the good and only tries to, I suppose, claim as much ground as it possibly can. I think it's in Dante. Maybe it's in Dante, or maybe, yeah, I think it's in Dante's Inferno, where he envisions Satan as being trapped in ice, and he
Yeah.
can't even flap his wings without God's approval, right? And this also shows up. Tolkien talks about this in the Silmarillion. The beginning of the Silmarillion, which is brilliant, is the whole creation myth of Middle Earth, like Genesis, but for Book of Genesis, but for Middle
I see.
Earth. And in the Silmarillion, there's the god character of the Silmarillion is called Eru Ilúvatar, and Eru Ilúvatar creates what we might call like angels, some
Yeah.
number of angels, 10, 12, 15 angels, something like that. And one of those angels is Melkor, which is the Satan figure. And there's a quote in the Silmarillion. I wrote it down. I can pull it up, or I can just recite it from memory. It says Eru Ilúvatar speaking to Melkor, saying, "And you, Melkor, will see that your deeds end up generating things from which you will have never devised." Right? This
Yeah.
idea that no matter what you do, it's all going to just serve me. So there is evil, but evil is ultimately stifled by the overwhelming, tidal wave torrent of unstoppable good. And
I
so,
like that.
yeah, I wish I could say that's my idea, God's idea. So, but I think so. That's how I answer it. Is that,
Yeah.
from our limited perspective as human beings, there is evil, and we can choose to do evil deeds. And we'll just set aside the question of predestination or anything like that. We'll set all
Yeah.
that aside. But ultimately, the overwhelming force of God is so good that evil will always be stifled and defeated, even in its own best efforts.
I like that. That's a poetic way of getting at that. And I like it, like you said at the beginning. You said this isn't some invite to everything's one type
Yeah.
thing, because that's what you would think. And then your explanation is much more theologically imbued. And I think it's really, that's how it should be. That's how it needs to be. But that's a good conception, because evil and good are hard to reconcile for a lot of people. And I think
Yeah.
society and culture has made it difficult. But that's a good extraction of what it is and what it isn't, in the Christian context, as all bad and all evil is going to be transfigured into something that works ultimately for the betterment of the entire narrative. So that's a good way
Yes.
of looking at it, I think. And um, a big part of some of my experiences coming back to Christianity as well were involved with the use of psychedelics briefly for a
Mm,
period of time. And I heard in some of your dialogues, I've heard you mention ayahuasca, and I've heard you mention psychedelics,
yeah.
and you talked with the author of Psychedelic Christian, which was a really neat conversation.
Paul.
Um,
Yeah. Paul
yeah,
Reese.
you guys had a great dialogue, go back and forth,
He's
and I
awesome.
thought it was really cool. Yeah. And so that struck me as something interesting. And I don't usually talk about psychedelics too much or anything, but I wanted to ask maybe if you had some experiences from the psychedelics that impacted your faith right
Yeah.
now.
Mm. Oh, yeah. Yes, is the short answer. I mean, I've I had used psychedelics for a very long time, not regularly, like it wasn't a regular practice, but it was part of my life.
Yeah.
I was part of the DJ rave scene, during the 2000s and 2010s, and that was just like part of it. And as part of that, I experimented with a number of different substances. Never anything like heroin or anything, or meth or anything like that, but psychedelic type substances, acid and mushrooms. And I would say that the ones that most influenced my theology, you might say, were the bad trips, where it was really like something has gone really wrong in my own mind and my own thought process. And there's no way out of this. I just have to find something larger than myself to lean on. And, that was like, that was a big part of the psychedelic usage, really helping me with that, was reaching out to something beyond myself. I don't know that I would have called it God, but looking back on those, that were definitely moments where that's what I was touching to kind of keep me,
Yeah.
above where I could have gone. Let's say,
Yeah.
not in a self-harming danger kind of way, but just like things, like I can imagine being in quite a lot more pain in some of those circumstances had I not had there not been, some light. I'll just as an example, on one of my, I think it was the first time I ever did acid, maybe, there was a moment where like I had fallen from the sky like Icarus, and I was laying on this cracked earth, just my body kind of broken, bleeding out. And I just remember seeing this little candle floating just above me, and I could look at that candle and be like, there's still some light left in my soul, some light left in me, so I'm going to be okay. That could have been a very different moment without that. And then I don't know that I've ever talked about that publicly before. So I've been, I'm happy to talk about this stuff. That bad trips don't get talked about enough. Like there's a lot of discussion publicly about ayahuasca and stuff today, but people
Yeah.
don't really talk about how bad a bad trip can get. And like there's no off switch. There's no like, I'm not enjoying this movie, I'm going to put on something else. It's like, no, you're living it. There's no escaping your own consciousness. I would say that my experience with ayahuasca also contributed to my theology, because there was really no denying after I've had 15 ayahuasca ceremonies.
Oh,
There's yeah, it's a few. And I did one retreat where we did 7 ceremonies in 12 days.
oh
So
man, that's that they call that boot camp for sure, or
yeah,
initiation, or wow.
yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, thank you. Hopefully, I'm not treading on
No.
water. Okay, cool. Well, yeah, I would.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, in those circumstances, after doing ayahuasca, there's really no way you can deny that the world of spirit exists, right? Like I could say that, okay, so maybe I'm fooling around with some psychedelic substances casually that I shouldn't be messing with, and maybe everything that I'm seeing is just a projection of my own mind, whatever.
Yeah,
With ayahuasca, it's very difficult to say otherwise. Like you go really walking a little bit, wading out a little bit into the world of spirit, and you walk away being like, there is a spiritual world. That's just how it is.
yeah,
And so having that knowledge, that real knowledge that there's something out there beyond the material, definitely played into my theology quite a bit. It was from that point I could no longer deny that religion or whatever is just something made up by people. Like, no, there's something out there.
yeah, yeah. And, same way for me. I
Mm.
think is it just gave me a contactual, um, a physical, uh, coming face to face with that. And what I would say is it did for me as well was it humbled me a lot in my
Mm.
worldview. Is after coming out of like my first experience with LSD and stuff, it was like, oh wow, I don't know anything about anything. That's what
Yes.
I remember
Yeah.
telling myself the next day. I was like, that was quite amazing, whatever that was. And it's like, I need to start listening and stop talking immediately.
Good for you.
and
That's
and
amazing, actually.
that's all I could feel like was like, wow, I need to go back to level 0 and work my way up, and definitely stop approaching people antagonistically about religion, because it
Mm.
obviously exists. I just don't know which the truth is, or what, but obviously everything wasn't just physical matter, which
Oh
is
wow.
common in the West, especially for me. I didn't even realize that that's how I saw the world, was that consciousness and mind and everything were separate. I didn't even think about it being an issue, but then I questioned it. Where did consciousness, it couldn't have just come from rearrangement of inanimate matter to one point every once in a while. Then it finally had choice and the consciousness and subjective elements.
Yeah,
I was
amazing.
like, yeah, but for some reason it just seemed typical in the West for everybody to assume that material gave rise to that.
Uh-huh.
And I never questioned that most basic premise. I never went back and said, oh, the philosophical debate of mind and matter, that seemed like it didn't even exist to me. And
That's really
so
interesting.
so that was kind of what psychedelics did to me. And then they basically dismantled dualism and materialism for me, and made me, go back and try to figure out about consciousness. And my next step after that was like, how can I get to these psychedelic states in any other way? And it turned out people had been talking about this for a while, and that Buddhists and meditators and
Oh, okay.
practitioners had been achieving these very high level contemplative states to where they can almost go back into on demand a peaceful, blissful state of pure consciousness.
Or
And I
so
was
they
like, that's
said.
what, or so they said, exactly. So
Yeah.
so then I started doing spiritual practices like meditation and less of the psychedelics. And I was going to ask you, on top of the ayahuasca and all that, do you see any contemplative practices? Have you been involved in any as a Christian? Any contemplative Christianity is an interesting breed of
Mm.
Christianity, and it's not often advertised or brought to the fore. But I wanted to ask you, bridging from psychedelics to that, is I found my way into meditation through those. Did you
Mhm.
find Christian spiritual practices that helped you center yourself and such?
Well, I don't know that I've found Christian practices in that way besides reading the Bible and prayer, but I did participate in a Buddhist Vipassana retreat,
Um,
one of those 10-day silent meditation retreats where it was 10 hours of meditation for 10 days, where you're supposed to just empty your mind, right?
yeah.
The Buddhist technique of Vipassana is you're supposed to focus your consciousness onto a little piece of skin, and you're supposed to run your consciousness over the entire surface of your body, right? And like a scan. And then by
Yeah.
doing that, the notion of the separate physical body dissolves and you become just kind of pure consciousness, and then you can sink into that state. And so while I was doing that, I actually discovered something that wasn't supposed to be there. I found my free will.
Yeah.
Right? That was the thing,
Yeah.
is I got down to the point like, okay, I saw a part of myself where it was like this little part of me that was like avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure. Like I could see it doing that. And the whole Buddhist theory is that because there's this instinctive part that mechanistically avoids pain and pursues pleasure, that there's no you in there. And what I
Yes.
realized, like, that's the way, to be fair, that's the way most people are. But there was still a me that could say, no, I'm going to postpone pleasure and pursue things that are difficult and challenging and painful. And that's my free will that I can exert power over with my conscience. I exist. I found on a Buddhist meditation retreat,
Yeah.
I found that they were wrong, which they're probably not used to. So that was a big theological thing for me. And then, now my practice is just prayer. It's really
Yeah.
like, it's really reading the Bible. I find a lot of tranquility in that. And when I pray, I just say essentially a never ending list of thank yous. I
Yeah.
remember when I was living in San Francisco, I would see occasionally homeless people, because there are a lot of homeless people in San Francisco, with signs that say, "Smile, you woke up." And I was like, why should I smile because I woke up? Like, if I didn't wake up, I would, how would I know? And I always had this reaction to that. But then I reached this point not too long ago where it's like, wow, like I not only need to give thanks for everything in my life, but my body, my existence, my mind, and every breath is a gift. And when I touched that place, my prayer just changed a whole lot. So I find a lot of peace and tranquility in prayer.
Yeah, good answer. Yeah, the prayer is like something that seems so far-fetched and wild to me as a coming out of the Protestant background I was in,
Right.
and then being an atheist. It was just like I'm talking to an imaginary friend. And why don't, and my whole worldview was go do something about it, or but talking to yourself sure isn't going to heal it. And then I started to realize the contemplative aspect of prayer, and that it almost started to begin to feel as if I was more, when I was becoming more involved in prayer, that it turned into more of me listening, or trying to listen,
Yeah.
or try trying to hear my conscience, or trying to hear that inner voice that talks to you.
Mm.
I felt like there could be, as I would pray and as I would read and contemplatively certain passages of the Bible, that if I read it in a dialogical way to where I may have been interacting with the characters at that time, where I could envision the surroundings and see myself there, then it was more like I'm reading the text and then waiting to see maybe if something, if an answer comes, or if solace will a lot of times just come
Yeah.
as a comforting thing. But prayer became to me somewhat of a listening exercise, where it was more concentrated on, like they say, like it says in the Gospels, the Lord's Prayer is really all you need, because the Father already is aware of what you need.
Yeah.
Um, and so I was like, well, that's true and such. But so I was thinking, well, He knows what I need. So as I bring these questions to the table through the reading of these texts, and listen more intently and be less vocal about what I want and how I think it should be, and more listen to what I find, or inspiration that may come out of nowhere from that.
Yeah. There's something so powerful about that I think even my new age mind, I was never an atheist. Even when I was reading Carl Sagan, I read his book, The Demon Haunted World, which I still have that copy that I read, which was a big thing for me. Even when I was reading Carl Sagan, I never became an atheist. I always had a sense of faith in something. But as I got into the new age world, the new age doesn't really conceive of God as anything personal. It's this thing that's has fractured itself into a billion different separate pieces, and you're one of them. And the only way that you'll have any communion with this God is if you cease existing and if you become God. It's
Yeah.
very isolating. It's
Yeah.
very isolating. And versus to be able to say like, no, I am a created being, and I'm loved by God, and I'm seen by God, and I was made and I'm understood by God, and not only God but Christ, who suffered and died and rose for my sins, and the angels, the whole community of angels. That's a whole
Yeah.
big thing in the Bible. It's just like
Mhm.
the furthest thing from alone. The angels are rooting for you. Christ died
Yeah.
for you. God's calling you home to him, and it's such a wonderful thing to be a part of. And you said like imaginary friend. Like, I don't think there's anything imaginary. I know how you meant it, like satirically,
Yeah.
but it's the most profound thing to discover there's nothing imaginary about it at all. And it's actually a little scary.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, it's the conception that was put into my head, or I generated to myself, of this giant bearded man that sits in a particular place in the sky. And I reference
Right.
that connotation for the sake of, for people who are atheists and everything, to see that, hey, I was the same type of atheist, because my goal is partly to help the conversations I have be a bridge. For what I realized is, how can I take my newfound faith and get more people to it in the way that would utilize my expertise the best.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, oh, well, that would be reaching out probably to people who are militantly atheists, who have been exactly who I was, and try to start there and have subtle discourses that can have show them how science and philosophy ends up transmutating itself into nothing different than what God is. That ontology becomes an actual subject worth looking into, rather than just the causative, scientific, deterministic front. And so I I think that that's an interesting thing. And you were saying about faith, it's I realized that atheism actually required more faith. I started understanding that to
Yeah.
wake up in the morning, you had to have faith in the sun rising,
Right.
had to have faith in the pilot of your airplane not crashing. You have to have faith in a lot of things that you just say isn't blind, but it really is.
Hmm. Absolutely. You have to have faith in the power of your own mind, right? That's what it is that like, well, I've thought everything through, and my own mind tells me that there's no God. The
Yeah.
faith that you're actually ascribing is in the power of your own mind to have considered all of the possible evidence, which is
Wow.
infinite, and then properly weighed as in weights and measures, without bias, and made the purely rational numerical calculation, essentially, that there's no God, right?
Yeah.
Because your heart is not a good decision making tool. The heart acts almost only on faith and desire, right?
Yeah.
So it's like it's your mind, cold, clean rationality is ready to can only figure this out. So you're ultimately saying the faith of my rational mind is the thing that I ultimately have faith in. So you become your own God, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
which is not what I wanted. And I don't have any problem. Maybe there's a problem, which I assume is present with a lot of people, is that it's the reliance on your own self, and
Yeah.
not wanting to subordinating yourself to something greater. Whereas all I wanted at the time when I was going through the search before I came to Christianity was to find the God that I could surrender to, because I realized
Oh, wow.
I came to the conclusion, like I kind of mentioned, of some tribulation times that weren't good. And then I went about it, and I was like, I understand now that I can't do this by myself.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it was getting to that point where it's like, all I want to do is just, if you're real and I can have any contact with God, then at that point I will change course and speak for him and do the work he would like me to do. If only there could be some reassurance that he existed, then I could get over this logical impasse I created. And that came to me through the book of Job
Mm.
specifically. Um,
This
then
used to be
I
my favorite
realized,
too.
holy crap, that is, well, yeah. What do you think about the book of Job as just a book in the Bible? It's such an amazing book.
Oh,
Why?
there's so many different books of the Bible that are just so
Yeah,
full of such genius is not really the right word, but you know what I mean. And to
yeah,
read I love God's speech to Job.
yeah,
It's like, who are you?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
hold on, I'm going to tell you how it is. And Job's like, I'm sorry,
Yeah, that's what's so great about it
my
is
bad.
exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I like that too. It's so because that's what I wanted. I knew I was arrogant. I knew I thought I had known it all. But at this point, I exactly who I wanted God to tell me, who are you?
Yeah.
Be quiet and do my will, and things will go well around you.
Yeah.
I needed to be told, hey, you don't know very much, person. You don't have
Yeah.
very much stuff to know. And the book of Job kind of puts into perspective all that. And even like in the book of Jonah, where God gives him a vine by which to serve as shade for him after he's gotten off the boat, after he's gotten back on land. And the next day, Jonah wakes up and the vine is gone. And
Mhm.
God asks him the same question. He says, well, where were you when I made plants to begin with? Where that same trend is interesting, and it's needed because it's a humbling of the human
Yeah.
to below God, essentially.
Absolutely. And that's a unique flaw. I mean, that goes all the way back to the garden, right? And
Yeah,
hath God really said, and you will be like gods? It's like, oh, that sounds good to us,
yeah,
right? It's
yeah,
like, yeah, and so, I was thinking recently that I think someone could make the argument, oh, well, if I were in the garden, I obviously wouldn't have chosen to eat the apple, right?
yeah,
But what I was thinking about that is, well, Adam and Eve were both individually fashioned with God's own hands, right? Like God personally carved Adam out of dust and took Eve from his rib, and then there you go, right? So what makes you think that a billion generations, or however many, 1,000 generations removed from the original creations, that you would have done better than they did? Right?
yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely not. But then that flipped into something really interesting, because
Uh-huh.
the power of Satan must have been pretty remarkable, because we can look at it and say, obviously God said not to do it, but the hypnosis that must have been, waged over them to warp them, because it
Yeah,
seems to be rational to us. I don't, maybe
yeah.
it's because we're saved. I mean, I don't even know. But anyway, the point is like, if Adam and Eve couldn't do it, we probably wouldn't have pulled it off either.
No, yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, yeah, it must have been because you have God give, your creator there before you, essentially manifest and make creating you, and then you still fall prey to the earliest form of manipulative acts that could have ever occurred.
Yeah.
And so you're right. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about how, I mean, it must have been a powerful manipulative tool. Satan must have always been the literal king of lies, the origin of choosing evil, the something by which that you could be convinced of um, pretty easily in direct face of your creator having just made you from nothing. Um, that's a wild way of thinking about it. It's interesting.
Mm.
Um, and I guess there was something about Adam and Eve that I had just, oh, I was going to say one of the things I found to follow up on Adam and Eve. One of the things that when I was looking into consciousness, specifically self consciousness, um, I never thought about consciousness this deep to begin with, ever really. But then I always thought about it as like, oh, that just means you have consciousness. That means you're able to tell that you're going to die one day. You're able to tell that you're you and all
Hmm.
that. But self consciousness is a dramatically interesting thing. And it's something that I was like, when I read Genesis, finally, when I thought, I'm finding the answers, I read Genesis and I was like, boom, that is, God, I mean, this is right. Because he makes it to where they're all of a sudden aware of their nakedness. But
Yeah.
prior to that, they weren't even aware that they were naked. And I think it might have been because they weren't endowed with this self consciousness yet. They didn't.
Hmm.
And so it was almost like the origin of whenever a bad choice was made, self consciousness came out as a consequence. And
Hmm.
now all of a sudden they're embarrassed by their own nakedness. Whereas before, there could have been no embarrassment because there had been no sin. There had been no, there there wasn't this egoic. And then when you get your self-conscious, oh, I'm naked, and you're embarrassed, well, that's the origin of the ego. It's the origin of being so
Hmm.
self-aware that self becomes the domineering charioteer of your life. And so to me it seemed kind of like that, like almost Adam and Eve's mistake and wrong of with their will of choice ended up ending in this the origin of pride is
Hmm.
what I was thinking. And I was going to ask you what your thoughts on something like that were.
Yeah, I agree. I think what's most striking to me, and you highlighted, is that the first emotion that Adam and Eve are ever recorded as feeling is shame,
Yeah.
right? You know, we're walking in the garden. There's a book, there's a series of books called the Space Trilogy or the Ransom Trilogy by C.S. Lewis that I highly recommend. I fell in love with the second book. All the books are great, but the second book, Paralandra, was my favorite because there's a bit of an Edenic vision. Because the Genesis and all the books in the Bible, for that matter, with the exception of maybe Job, it's not written like we understand literature today. Like if you'd go pick up, I'm just the Brothers Karamazov. It's just sitting on my shelf right there.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
yeah, it's a great book. So excuse me. And so that's written in this narrative style where it's like it's literature. It's meant to have sound and shape and color and depth, right? And to kind of
Yeah.
be engrossing. That style of the novel actually didn't get invented until like the 1400s with Miguel de Cervantes and Don Quixote. So you
Oh,
rewind like 3,000 years prior to that, when the Bible was written, like they weren't writing literature, right? So there's a lack of detail that our modern minds that's used to reading novels is looking for and can't find, which I think is why it's difficult to read the Bible sometimes. So we have to read in to the words that aren't really there. So like what was Adam and Eve's experience of being with God like before the fall? They probably didn't perceive themselves as separate from God in any meaningful way. Like they did, but not really. But then when they disobeyed, they were separate from God and they were immediately ashamed of themselves, and like they immediately covered up, like they felt it right away. And even as I talk my way through that, like, I guess through the process of sanctification, I can feel myself being in communion with God more than I think I ever have in my life. And the notion of like disobeying right now, like, yeah, I'd probably feel pretty terrible too.
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I know.
It,
Yeah,
it
that.
lives in us, it echoes in our bodies.
Yeah, yeah, that's a fascinating way of looking at it too, because in the Protestant fundamental kind of Christian theology that I had understood in my upbringing, always that when I became an atheist and everything, I had this counter argument towards it, where it was like, oh, well, you guys are Christians just because of Pascal's wager. That basically you would rather, you could choose to be Christian, and it gives you, and they were, and they always looked at it towards us as like, oh, you get a magical prayer and then you can do all the wrong you want, you're always forgiven. And that was how it was framed, like
Yeah.
in
And
and
to be
I
fair,
don't know why.
a lot of Christians act like that.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's not a slide at that at all. It's just that's how they literally preach it, that's how they meant it to sound, and that was it. And now I realize that, oh, that actually signing up for Christianity, if you want to say signing up, is initiation into one of the most self-denying, most
Yeah.
and demanding, the
Yeah.
most. I mean, being a disciple and following Christ is no task you pick up to get a free ticket out of your punishment by any
Right.
means. And so I found that a unique thing, is that Christianity actually in the Gospels and Christ demands a lot of you. It doesn't give you an easy life. It doesn't
Yeah.
say you'll have an easy life. It
No.
doesn't guarantee that.
Yeah. If you want to exploit it, as a thing that you wear, like, oh, I can just pray and say I'm sorry and be forgiven. I mean, that's exploiting that. That's not actually Christianity. First of all, that's attempting to exploit a belief system to convince yourself of your own virtue, which is ultimately a failed endeavor because you never had true faith to begin with. And what people forget is that that happens with religions all over the world. Like, Islam does horrible things, obviously, in the name of this religion. Hinduism does as well. Buddhists do as well. Like, bad people will use any philosophy to justify their own behavior. Capitalism, pick it, doesn't matter,
Yeah.
right? So that Christianity gets held to such a standard is unreasonable, but it's also understandable because a lot of people don't actually know what actual Christianity is. They think it's the bearded man in the sky,
Exactly.
and they think it's Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, and they don't actually understand the significance of what it means to be fallen beings and to have God take on human form to sacrifice himself to pay our debts for us. And all that's asked of us in exchange is just true faith. It's like the most precious gift, and repentance from sin, the most precious gift for the lowest cost. It's like, it's so
It's beautiful.
challenging. Yeah.
There's a lot of guilt, at least for myself, whenever some of the truth of the Bible started feeling objectively true to me
Yeah.
after all of that searching, was like, oh wow, I remember even talking to some of my friends and some family I hadn't seen in a long time, and telling them about my newfound interest in theology and the Bible, and was telling them, well, it just seems like too large of a debt that I can't repay. It's too much grace. It felt like
Yeah.
at the beginning was that, oh, I don't, how do I mean, yeah, I get it. I've been forgiven, but I don't deserve that. And there's no way I could, so it's like,
Yeah.
what do I do now? And slowly you fit into what the Christian narrative is, which is one of suffering and failing, and then, you know, revising your efforts and trying to continue forward. Um, that's what's the greatest thing as compared to all the other religions we're talking about, is Christianity provides a narrative framework that you can intersect with. At least I found myself with Job, like we were talking about some of the things that happened to him. I don't think of myself at all like him, but some of the events that are happening to me, I was like, maybe this is a book that's kind to relate to regular human life, that there's tribulations and there's bad things that happen to even people who are trying to do good.
Yeah.
Here's a prime example one. But whenever it happened to me, I didn't steadfastly stay truthful in my faith. I didn't, I was no Job by any means, but
Mm.
it's a story that shows you that there's a God was aware of undeserved suffering. He was aware of evil. He it wasn't like a question that hadn't been asked. It's just a question, maybe the answer is too far outside of human knowing.
Well, we want everything to fit into a logical, rational, cause and effect kind of framework. But I think sometimes, um, I'm going to try and talk my way through this. I think sometimes we have cause and effect backwards. Like we think because X happened, I suffered. I did something wrong, and then therefore I suffered because of something I did wrong. If we're
Yeah.
suffering and we didn't do anything wrong, why are we suffering? But if we look at cause and effect from the perspective of God, maybe like you need to suffer because something else needs to happen. The suffering is the cause, and something else later is the effect. But we can't see forward in time. We can't see the benefits of our suffering. I think it's Joseph, right? Joseph was in prison. He was in prison in Egypt, what, for 2 years, right?
Yeah.
And what did he do? He interpreted dreams in prison, and then he was elevated to the court of Pharaoh. And would he have been able to get there if not through the suffering and dishonor of being in prison? Probably not. That was the path God had set out for him. And maybe that was, his suffer. Maybe it was suffering for him, but from God's perspective, it's like, that's the road to get you there. Trust me, I'll get you there, and it'll be amazing. And that can be really difficult for people who are like, I didn't do anything wrong. Why am I suffering? It's like, well, you're
Yeah.
suffering because something really right is going to happen to you. And that's the path. That's the narrow path that you need to pass through to get there. And a lot of people they fail passing through that narrow path. The suffering is too much. They quit, right? Or they give up, or they lose faith or whatever, and they fall off. But the truly devoted to God stay on that path and stay connected to God even until the very end. And I was even thinking about this today, like, even though Jesus was God, in his story, there's a little bit of that where he followed that narrow path to God all the way up onto the cross. And even on the cross, he's like, my God, why have you forsaken me? Like even in that last, I mean, that's a reference to a psalm. But if we take it at face value, the words at face value, did he really experience God's separation even in that last moment? Like, did he obey up until the very last moment?
Last moment.
Right? And it's like, did he even have to experience that? When everything else had pulled back, even God pulled back, he still obeyed. And that's what it means. Right?
Yeah. No, yeah, I like that. That's really that is what exactly how, I mean, that's how I didn't know I saw it like that, but you putting words to it exactly, it kind of, it synergizes with what I already, my pre-existing thought too. And
Awesome.
like you said, like his journey of Christ up to the cross embodies the whole journey of life, to through suffering, through dragging your own cross, through bringing your burdens and your fears and your failures and your mistakes with you as a figurative weight of a cross on your shoulder, that you, like Jesus does say, he says, you pick up your cross and follow me. He's saying, Jesus isn't saying you didn't suffer, you don't. He's saying, pick all of that up, and just like I
Yeah.
drag it behind you in honor of the highest good. So when you do die, that all that suffering, all that pain ends on Calvary, ends with your physical death, but it's in me that I suffered the worst, so that when you suffer, you understand its context.
Yes, well said. Well said. Nothing
Thanks.
we can go through compares to what God Himself suffered on our behalf. Like, and even a tenth of that would break any one of us just to be falsely accused. Like, how much did we rebel against false accusers in our own lives?
Yeah.
And that was the beginning, right? And like Jesus' own disciple betrayed him with a kiss. Like, ow,
Yeah.
right? Like that's
Yeah.
just the beginning. It's the
Yeah.
beginning of the passion story. Like, oh,
Yeah,
you
it's the
know,
beginning. Yeah, it's the beginning. It has all the facets of the most suffering you could possibly endure. If I had to think of the worst mental, physical, psychological trauma I could experience, I would probably write the story of Christ. It
yeah,
just and there's that interesting part too. I was talking with somebody recently about this, about how I think it might be Exodus or Genesis, where Moses has the bronze serpent, and it's raised up in the desert, and they're all looking at it and all that. And then Christ says the same thing in the Gospels. He says something to the tune of, I need to be lifted up like the serpent in the woods. He's talking about the time in Exodus. And it's like, what? That's such an odd thing to say. And I think it's just, there's this symbolism of the serpent, and the
Mm,
suffering of the serpent, and to raise it up above everything else is to look at what you see as the worst. Like if you looking like an example like in the animal kingdom is that if a group of chimpanzees, this is something weird, but a group of chimpanzees were to come upon a snake as a colony of chimps, they, instead of attack it, instead of doing anything or running away from it, some of them up to like 24 hours, they will call all the other chimps over there, and they'll all stare unifocally at the serpent until, for like maybe upwards of hours, and just staring at it, understanding its possibility to kill them. And they will all do that and observe it, and then eventually after several hours, they will run away from it. But I think it was Jordan Peterson potentially, who was drawing this analogy of primate behavior back to something about that story of where you have to gaze upon that which is the worst in order
mm.
to first come to know it the way you need to understand. In order to understand your suffering, you've got, like, there's something about staring at what you fear the most and making that an endeavor to overcome it. And something about the serpent in the Exodus, and the serpent that Christ said he was supposed to be like. It's like you gaze upon the most sacred, because you can't reach it. Even if it's scary, you have to overcome it. So I found that kind of an interesting thing. It's the notion, yeah, that a lot of times you have to have an encounter with something a little bit malevolent or a little bit off-putting in order to understand the beauty of the opposite.
Yeah, you have to, gosh, isn't that true? What a beautiful story. You have to be able to look at the thing that scares you. You have to be able to look at darkness. You have to be able to look at glory as well. And you can't look away from either of those, right? And that's the thing is only as you can, the darkest thing that you can look at probably parallels to the brightest thing that you can look at,
Yeah.
right? And this is the problem of evil, which I think we'll come back, I think we're coming back to, is that
Yeah.
if you have the courage to look into the heart of darkness of humanity, just how dark things can get, and then you'll see reflected in it the light of the true good. And this is why I feel bad for a lot of people that refuse to look at, we might call them alternate explorations for historical world events, like some of the things we're going through, and this
Yeah.
that they dismiss people as conspiracy theorists or whatever. It's like, no, look at this, because it's only by looking at this, and for sure by looking at this, that you'll pop out and realize if that amount of darkness exists, there must be light. Because I refuse to live, if nothing else, I refuse to live in a universe that's defined by that amount of evil without a counterbalancing good. And that's the thing. It just so happens that there is one religion in the world that talks about a counterbalancing good, and that's Christianity. I haven't found another one. I
No,
haven't, yeah.
no, yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, please.
Yeah, yeah, I agree that I agree that there was this gap, there was this missing link, this missing puzzle piece, in every other religion that lacked the ability to integrate your own narrative of life into, because it seems like narrative and story, whatever that is a primary aspect of what it means to be human, is to be able to illustrate a story with language. And
Yeah.
language is very unique. It's extremely unique, really. And that's why when, like, cry or when the God the Father in the Bible does say, or Saint John writes, in the opening line of John 1:1, it's just God in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's like the Word is, because there's only one species of people on the planet that can even use words. It's
Yep.
humans, and we're very unique creatures, and we have the power to reason and all that. It's like the Word became man. The Word is what was with God. It was God, and it also became you as a human. It embodied the logos. Like there's an actual, and the thing about Christianity that I find is like it gives you a person, Jesus,
Hmm.
as a logos, you could see what, oh, this is the purpose, is all wrapped up in the incarnation.
Hmm.
It's this only principle where God became man, innocently was born into a manger, was very defenseless, was just like you. Um, how could there be a more powerful narrative too? I
Yeah.
mean, if it wasn't true, it would be mythology, but it's so true almost that it's wild.
Yeah. I like, you just made me think of something. We can kick this ball around
Yeah,
for a
sure.
second. So you said that the word is story, and the word was God, and the word was with God. So if we substitute, if we hold in our minds this notion of the word as also meaning Jesus and also meaning story. So in the beginning, Jesus was there, and the story was there, and the story was God, and the story was with God. This is this grand narrative of which Jesus is the center of it. So like what that is essentially saying is that the human story was written from the beginning. In the
Yeah.
beginning, the human story was there. It was all there in the very beginning,
Yep.
from from the garden, the fall and redemption, and then ultimate revelation, and the kingdom. It's all there in the very beginning. Like,
Yep.
look,
Yeah,
like,
that's what it means. I think that's what
oh,
it means.
oh man, how can you? I mean, like, how can you listen to this and like not be Christian?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
but like, why would like you get that? Like, that story is so much better than like, you know what? We're all just little fragments of God, and at someday we're all going to be God again. Like, that's like okay, like maybe, but like this is so much better. It's so
Yeah.
much better, right? I want to participate in that story.
Exact. Yes. Yeah. The greatest story ever written. And I think your reference earlier, your allusion to C.S. Lewis, what a person to think about now that we're talking about story and religion, and think about a person who was very reluctant to come to religion himself,
Right?
but used the power of narrative and storytelling as a way to propagate the Christian narrative into the popular culture areas of society. Like you create Narnia, and like there's Aslan, and he has to die in order for the kingdom to live, and it's like this notion of sacrifice that's very central to the doctrine of Christianity. C.S. Lewis was a master of trying to make a better narrative within stories that
Yeah.
also, and same thing, you mentioned Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was
Yeah.
I mean, a genius, and got, and he's not a character. He doesn't have to be a character in his own stories, but he's the author of the story itself. It's kind of
Mhm.
like God. I mean, he himself is. He doesn't have to, be a character in this whole thing, a physical being, but he could still be very much so the author or the architect. And
Mhm.
those two guys, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, you mentioned Mere Christianity. What did you think about that? What did you think about that? That's an excellent book, right?
Incredible. It's incredible.
Yeah, yeah.
That was the only book about Christianity that I knew of other than Simply Christian. So I finished reading Simply Christian, and like the book Mere Christian, the term Mere Christianity was just floating around in the back of my brain. I knew C.S. Lewis had written it, but I hadn't really read a whole lot of C.S. Lewis. So I'm like, okay, I guess the next book I'm going to read is Mere Christianity. And I had heard of Screwtape Letters, but I didn't know what it was. But I knew he'd written, so I ordered Mere Christianity, and I was like, I had no idea. Like, I knew C.S. Lewis was one of the big geniuses, greats of literature in the 20th century, but I had no idea he was such a Christian. And I think
Yeah.
that really contributed. That really contributed to being a very powerful force to convince me, to the extent that convincing was necessary. It's like, oh, wait a minute. Like, it's not just, because my experience with Christianity was like a lot of other people's. It was like maybe I saw a televangelist, or maybe I met some Christians, and that's a very different thing than someone like really encountering the depth and quality and thoroughness and overwhelming genius of C.S. Lewis's mind, and just reading these paragraphs. Like, I'm going to need to spend a whole day with just that paragraph because the genius in there is too much. And so to
Yep.
have found that a man that was that brilliant was a Christian was like, I really got to give this a second thought, right? And then I read the Screwtape Letters, And through my experiences with psychedelics and my own questioning of the nature of evil, I was like, yeah, all that feels really
Yeah.
real, right? It's like, like I think I get it. I think I'm in, right? So,
Amen to that. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. You were just mentioning how it's like the word was with God. It's everything was kind of at the beginning was foretold and was already told and was and is as it was. Well, C.S. Lewis does a great job of illustrating how that could be conceptualized metaphysically through the notion of how he goes through what time is. And it's a real bulky chapter, but on there he explains how you could have free will and a predetermined universe kind of simultaneously, to where like God exists outside of time. So everything, it's not that one thing's happening now for God, then another, but it's like it's all happening as it was currently, but all at once or something.
mhm.
The way, I mean, I'm
Like a
butchering it, but
book.
C.S. Lewis does a good job of illustrating this notion, and it can be conceived after that to see how it could be such that the plan is in place and implemented, and it was and is from the beginning, but there's still this element of free agency in there, because that is a lot of times like a metaphysical impasse for people to understand. It's like, how could there be any free will if God's all knowing? If he knows everything, he knows your choices, so therefore you're not making them. And there's always like that, like a circular argument you can get into, but Lewis does a good job of advancing the dialogue on that particular matter. And just in general, Lewis, like you said, he's just a master of language. And to see it, they made that documentary about him called The Most Reluctant Convert. And
Mm,
it's like, it's a movie, but there's also like on YouTube an hour live play of it. And I didn't realize up until that point how long it took him to reconcile Christianity as the truth. I mean, he went through battling himself constantly up until the latest part of his life.
mhm.
So it's always an interesting thing to see. And same thing with, like you just mentioned, Dostoevsky or the brothers Karamazov. I just recently read that book. I didn't realize how great that literature was.
Yeah,
That's
it's
good
incredible.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the chapter on the Grand Inquisitor, like
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
that's like so brilliant.
Yeah, and you're just reading them, and you were talking about Carl Jung earlier, and you're starting to see like a master of the archetypal story.
Yeah.
Dostoevsky, I mean, he was, every archetype was so well defined and ironed out, and he carved these characters, and you could just feel that they were real characters. I mean, that is like the most visceral connection to a book I've ever had. I think fiction. It just blew my mind.
You know what you'll really like? Have you ever read Moby Dick?
No, I haven't.
Read Moby Dick. Read Moby Dick.
Okay, I
Yeah,
will
go.
absolutely.
Yeah,
I've been looking for some new literature in the realm of this that I could get
bro,
into.
bro. Like, like, like I enjoyed reading that book before I was Christian, and then after I was Christian, I went back and reconsidered that book, and I was like, oh man, like like, Melville got it. Melville absolutely got it. It's brilliant.
That's cool. Okay, good deal. That's something good, that good for me to read then. Um, yeah, that's neat. And I guess to kind of round out all of what we were talking about and come to a kind of a good place by which to conclude, we're talking about literature, and I wanted to ask you specifically. I've heard you read poetry before on your channel,
Yeah.
and that's, I really like that. I just found a new appreciation for poetry too in the past year. So on all the other stuff, I found appreciation for that. And um, you kind of mentioned, poetry's importance to the masculine role and stuff, I believe. And um, also just reading poetry in itself is like a thing that can be very rewarding and very visceral to connect with, the
Hmm.
writing of poets. Um, that being said, I read like a single book, Mark Twain's book, Joan of Arc. I read that a long
I
time
see it
ago.
behind you.
Yeah, it's on my shelf right there. Yeah, I was looking at that a second ago. And that, reading that, seeing Mark Twain having written a book like that.
Mm.
Have you ever read that?
I don't know that I've even heard of it.
Oh, okay. Mark Twain is quoted saying it's his most intricate, most demanding, and best work he ever produced.
Oh
That was his
wow.
opinion. He spent 12 or 13 years tracing out the life of Joan of Arc, going to all the French villages and French towns, trying to figure out how this could be true. The story of this 15-year-old girl saving France. I didn't even know about it either. I didn't know
Wow.
about the story. So I grabbed the book one day and read the back of it and was like, what? Mark Twain's best work? And then I realized, oh, Joan of Arc was a real person. And she, at 15 years old, with illiterate and coming from a very poor background, was able to commandeer the French army, saved them from being attacked by England, and commandeered all the quests and conquest, and was even illiterate but delivering high level speeches. And all of this, Mark Twain wanted to prove it wrong by saying, look, there's no way this could happen. Well, it actually, he did nothing but verify to himself that it actually did
Yeah.
happen. And there's so many more supernatural things that happened in her life. I mean, there's like a sword on display in a museum in France that she was documented having. She was 15 and it was buried like 150 years before she was born. She knew exactly where it was, how far it was buried, and they had recovered it in that time. And that sword still remains on display. This isn't any for like lore
Mhm.
or anything. This is a real sword that was found. It's She knew where it was located. So there, that was one microcosm of the macrocosm of what her life became as a servant of the higher power. She,
Mm.
and so anyways, that long story short, I went through that book and realized I had just a deep connection to what that book said, and realized, wow, that's true. Then where is God? I need to follow the same God. I need to find him and orient towards it. And so that book did that for me. What I was going to ask you is a book of literary magnitude, and some books can speak to people and do a lot for others. The church fathers as well are big writers for me. What kind of reading and literature do you find that helps you like relate to theological or philosophical concepts? Is there a certain type of literature or poetry or something, a poet that sticks out to you that people read or could read that would help them?
You've asked me three really awesome questions, and I'm going to try to
Oh,
answer. I'm
okay.
going to, no,
Sorry.
no, 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 really. Thank you. I'm going to try to
Yeah,
answer
yeah,
all of them. I'm going to try to
sure.
answer. Okay.
Excellent.
So, one of the challenges I've run into with reading poetry is not a lot of poets are Christian in the ways that we would identify, you and me, and they write poetry from a non-Christian kind of perspective. The one poet who doesn't, his name is George Herbert, and I believe George Herbert was an Anglican priest. And so Doug Wilson, if you know Pastor Doug Wilson, he has he will on Twitter. He doesn't use Twitter all that often, but when he does, he'll send out a line from a George Herbert poem every day. And there's big long stretches of time where it's like George Herbert quote of the day. So if you're looking for specifically Christian poetry, I recommend George Herbert. And I read one of his poems on my Poetry for Men series. The title
Cool.
escapes me right now. What's it called? Maybe it's called The Call, something like that. It's brilliant,
Okay.
brilliant poem. And it's actually really related to our conversation of Job as well. There's a
Okay.
Job-like aspect to it. Let's see, that's one. What
Yep.
books do I go to for literary inspiration? The one that I've been really stuck on lately is the C.S. Lewis Ransom trilogy, the Space trilogy.
Okay.
So absolutely brilliant. Just like C.S. Lewis writing fiction. I've read a lot of C.S. Lewis's nonfiction, but to read his fiction is just like it's just so grippingly brilliant and beautiful, especially the second two books. So there's Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength. Out of the Silent Planet is very good. Paralandra is just like I left my heart on Paralandra. Like that book is just it's just out of control good. Like he was channeling something truly divine.
Wow.
When I was finished that book, I stayed up until 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning reading it because I was like, I don't want to stop right now. I just want to read this all the way through the end. I don't care if the sun's coming up. Like, I need to finish this book. And like, I didn't want it to be over. I was like, don't ever end. And so I left my heart on Paralandra. That Hideous Strength is it's like a book of prophecy. It's even more striking to realize that he wrote That Hideous Strength in the 1940s, and the stuff that he's writing about, like we're seeing it now. Like
Yep.
it's like he just peeped into the future and is like, okay, this is how it's going to go. I'm going to write a book because that's how it is. Like we're used to thinking about Brave New World,
Yeah.
1984,
Yep.
Fahrenheit 451,
Yep.
that these books are prophecies of the future.
Yep.
That Hideous Strength is C.S. Lewis's version of that prophecy of the future from a Christian perspective. So that whole trilogy is brilliant. I've been really stuck on that. And I want to
That's
thank
cool.
I want to thank you. I want to thank
Yeah,
you very
sure.
sincerely, Ethan. This really means
Yes.
a lot to me because
Oh,
I read those books back in June, and my heart has been so stuck on those books. I was like, I can't. It's like a breakup. Like I can't let you go, right? And I can feel it in my heart. But the second you told me about Joan of Arc, I finally found another book I want to read. So
I
thank
really
you.
hope you do, because
I
I
will.
would
I'm going to
love,
order it
I
on
would,
Amazon.
yes, do
Oh,
it. That's
thank you.
awesome, because it gives, I have been trying, I've been telling people about this book throughout the last several months and everything, and people have found interest in it, but I've always wanted somebody who hasn't read it yet to who's interested like you are in literature to read it from a Christian. It's the perfect combination. I can read Moby Dick, you can read Joan of Arc,
Yeah.
and that gives both of us, because like you said, it's like a breakup. Whenever I get done with a really good book, or I find an answer to some sort of philosophical problem I've been wanting to find, and I'm like, dang it, it's over now. The search is over. But
Yeah.
I'm always intrigued to grab a new book. So I think I'll definitely check into Moby Dick, and I definitely am going to do that. So I think Joan of Arc will leave you with a sense of inspiration, kind of like I was saying, because of the writing of Mark Twain, plus just the beauty of the investigation work he did to write it and the way it's written. I think you'll find a lot of meaning from it.
Thank you, Ethan. I really appreciate that because I could feel
Yeah,
in my heart like I actually want to read that because I'm looking at all these books. I don't want to read that. I want to read that. It's like, oh, that I want to read. So
yeah,
thank you.
yeah, absolutely. And overall, just I want to say thank you for taking the time to come speak with me. I very much enjoyed it. I think it was a winding dialogue that touched on all kinds of things,
Well,
and centered back here at the purpose and the logos of Christ and the literature that's out there to find him. And so thank you very much for what you're doing. And I really like your podcast, and I like your guests, and
thank you.
the way you conduct your podcast, and the way your guests. You're doing a really good thing, and it's good work. And I just wanted to say it's noble, and it's seen by a lot of people, I think. And you're doing it's an excellent job, and I think you're doing a really good work with that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ethan. Congratulations on starting your own podcast and getting this going. Like it's an incredible journey, and I've really enjoyed this conversation as well. And I had a feeling with the Philosophical Gospel podcast, you and I would have a pretty
Yeah,
incredible conversation. This really worked out.
yes, it did. I'll read Moby Dick, and you can read Joan of Arc, and then maybe we can chat again in the future.
Done. That sounds great.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much. I will talk to you soon.
Thanks, Ethan.
Yeah. Thanks, Will.